Most of us are local. Again, if anyone's visiting, there's outlines on the tables. We have this rowdy crowd on the back that are making their way out, so we'll... I love midweek when people can visit and can get together. We're going to be starting on the book of Ruth. And so if you, in terms of chronology, just think Joshua, Judges, and then Ruth follows that. And it's very appropriate, and at least from my mind also very interesting that we would have Esther and Ruth, in that they are stories in very different times, very different cultures. But having said that, both of them feature God's activity and God's work in people that are outside of Israel. One of the things that I like to do in talking with people who've never read the Bible is to just start with a V and say, this is the first 11 chapters of the Bible, this is the universal part, and then starting in Genesis 12, there's a thread that runs all the way to the cross and to Christ. And obviously God is working, God's involved, these are his people, and the list goes on and on. However, underneath that thread, at different times you run into people like, oh, his name was Jethro, priest of Midian. And God's going to send Jonah to Nineveh. And so we have these people that kind of, well, and even Job, and we'll mention a bit about Job, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. One of our Old Testament teachers, he said, when I read the book of Job, I think of an Arabian sheik. No mention of Abraham, covenant, temple, anything else. And he said he's obviously a person of faith, but there are no direct connections to the thread that goes along. And so there were some very specific regulations, and I didn't write one of those down, but God's people were told specifically not to intermarry, and there were certain nations that were kind of perpetual enemies. And like I said, there was kind of so much to do. I left this out, and we may include it in a later one. This is gross, so get ready. The Moabites, which is where Ruth is going to be from, and the Ammonites are the offspring of Lot's wives getting him drunk, and they're sleeping with their father. So can I say distant cousins, meaning Lot and Abraham, related to each other. They go to Sodom and Gomorrah, they flee, and they think, well, we're just destitute and we're going to be here all by ourselves. So they plotted and planned, well, let's get our father drunk and we'll take turns sleeping with them. And so the Moabites, which is where Ruth comes from, when you read back in the story of Genesis, they are the offspring, kind of use the word of incest, and everybody knows what I'm trying to say, between Lot's daughters getting their father drunk and sleeping with him. So you can tell there's just this sense of distance as God's people are coming into the promised land. The Moabites and Ammonites at different times kind of harass them, and God says there'll be enmity between us. However, past our story tonight, at a certain point in time, and I'm with King David for a second, when Saul is still the king, and David is a man on the run, he feels like, I really need to send my parents away while King Saul is chasing us, and he sends his parents to Moab. So there's kind of a love-hate relationship between the two. In the distant past, they're related, but there had been all kinds of different conflict. And so our central idea is that Ruth is a great love story about common godly people living in a sinful age. I didn't list all of these, but you come from the book of Judges, chapter 17 on, and you keep hearing this phrase, every man did what was right in his own eyes. And rather than asking, what does the Lord say? What does Moses say? Then every man is doing what is right in his own eyes. And that is very much thematic through especially the last part of the book of Judges. And if you just think about the book of Judges as the parentheses, from the death of Joshua until Samuel anoints Saul as the king, we have 300 years. And God's going to raise at different times 12 different judges in different territories to help relieve his people from the pressure and the persecution that they're enduring. But they're just kind of like this circle that keeps going on, and God will deliver them, and then they'll become unfaithful, and they'll start either worshiping other gods or committing adultery and idolatry and on. And God will send people down, they'll be persecuted, and then they'll be delivered. And this circle just goes on for 300 years. And what is significant is that this wonderful love story takes place while this crazy cycle is going on. Do you remember when Elijah is in the cave? And I'm very empathetic with Elijah because he knows how vicious Jezebel is, and he knows that they're after him. And my folks would use the word pity party. He's having this pity party. He says, I'm the only one left. You know, God, there's just nobody left. I'm the only one left. And fair enough, that's how he felt. And yet, what does God tell him? There are 7,000 people who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And so while on the top, it's kind of like you have this kind of uniform ungodliness and all this sense of immorality and idolatry, and the list goes on, nonetheless, the Lord knows those who are his. And God tells Elijah, yes, I understand how dark things are, and I still love that little voice. A still voice spoke to him out of the whirlwind type thing. And rather than the thunder of Mount Sinai, then God speaks to him and just basically says, yes, I understand. Yes, I know you're running for your life. Yes, I know you feel alone. However, God knew of 7,000 Israelites who had not committed adultery. So this is a part of what I think about, is that here is these wonderful, wonderful, godly people, and the opening verse is going to say, in the days when the judges ruled. And so every time I read that, I just think of this cycle that's going round and round. And in the middle of this, here is this godly family who are going to be serving God and have such a wonderful background. I don't like to do this, so I wanted to kind of introduce this, and then we'll kind of work with this. There's a key word tonight, and I put this for the aim. I want to introduce, and sometimes even in a concordance, you will either see the word hesed, H-E-S-E-D, and sometimes in English there'll be a C-H. It'll either be kesed or hesed. And like, for example, if you take a Young's Concordance and you just look at love and you go into the Old Testament, you look up to the top and it'll be in italics, then this word hesed or kesed to me is one of the most significant fundamental words to describe God's love for Israel, covenant love and other things. And as we're going to see as we kind of walk through this, hesed, this sense of love with loyalty, this sense of faithfulness, this sense of kindness, is going to be demonstrated. It's going to be epitomized. It's going to become flesh in all three of the major characters of the story. Let me just use our word selflessness. Whether it is Naomi, whether it is Ruth, or whether it is Boaz, all three of these individuals in their own different parts of the story as we come to it are going to demonstrate an amazing sense of selflessness in looking out for the regard and the good of others. Our word agape does not really come along until the New Testament in terms of a common word, and obviously that's a Greek word rather than a Hebrew word. But when I think of agape, I think of a selfless regard for the good of others. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. Selfless regard for the good of others. And when I look at these characters, and again, I'm with the mother-in-law Naomi, I'm with Ruth, and when I'm looking at Boaz, then yes, they're hundreds of years before, but in their time, The word is hesed, but I'll say hesed tonight. And hesed, and we'll look at this, kind of describe the word, is a word within covenant. It's a word within agreement, but it is a commitment to look after the well-being and the welfare of other people. Those of us that knew Hugo McCord, Brother McCord woke up normally, if all went well, at 4 o'clock each morning. Did an hour of Hebrew, did an hour of Greek, and ran 2 miles, and then got his classes ready for school and ate breakfast and was at OC at 7:45. And that was just a normal routine. So obviously by reading and teaching and everything, visual, his eyes are very, very important. And at some point, Lois was having some difficulty, and they'd gone to see this doctor, and the doctor said, well, Lois, we're not sure if we're going to be able to keep this eye. And just at the drop of a hat, Brother McCord said, well, if she needs another eye, she can have one of mine. So here's a guy who's just studying all the time, and his eyes are very central to that, but his study wasn't as important as his love for Lois. And it was just like, we don't even have to talk about it. Don't have to flip a coin. If Lois needs an eye and if she can take one of mine, we'll let her have one of my eyes. And that's that sense, and we'll see this in agape in the New Testament, which we won't come back to that much, and this will be a part of our understanding of the word hesed. So in our English Bibles, Ruth comes from the time of Judges and follows that book in the Bible. And we've already mentioned this, every man's doing what is right in his own eyes. For those of you who have outlines, I want you to turn to the back, very back page, just turn over. And there's a reason for this. We touched on this in passing with Esther, but I wanted to kind of just give you this chart. They're sometimes called the 5 rolls. And these, obviously we're looking at scrolls and scripture being unrolled like this. And even today, according to some people I'm reading, when they read, especially the book of Ruth and some of these others, they have it written on like a scroll or roll. They still do this. But these 5 rolls are short, very significant books of the Old Testament, but they are read annually at different feasts and festivals as they come along. So here's the first one. Ruth is read during Pentecost. So we'll come on this when we go to the story, but again, real quick. The barley harvest begins early, and when the barley harvest is finished, then the Passover takes place. So we know Easter and Passover in terms of the spring, but I'm doing agricultural in Israel. And so the Passover typically takes place after the barley harvest is finished. And you will find this in Exodus 23, Leviticus 23, Deuteronomy 16. 3 times a year, the men are to appear before the Lord in Israel. So those of us that live way up in Galilee, if we're in a rural farming situation, then we get the barley harvest finished, and then we go and do Passover. Okay? We go back home. Pentecost is 50 days later, and while we're gone, the wheat is ripening, and during that 5 weeks when we go back home, then the wheat harvest will take place, and when we get finished with the wheat harvest, then we will go back to Jerusalem for Pentecost, and that's how we know that the first sermon in Acts 2 is on Sunday, because the Passover is going to be on a Sabbath, so you do 7 times 7, 49. And when the day of Pentecost was come, they were all gathered in one place, and the Holy Spirit descended upon them like tongues of fire. And the church was started on the first day of the week because Pentecost was 50 days after the Passover. Well, how appropriate when we have finished the barley harvest and the wheat harvest to read the book of Ruth. Because when Ruth comes home, and we're going to talk about this, there's no social welfare, there's no programs to support them, and Ruth chooses an older widow with no income and no absolute way just even to eat, over the possibility of having a husband in her own family. Can I use the word destitution? I mean, they're in a hard way. And a part of what is just so heartwarming about Ruth's decision is that she could have gone back home, married, lived in among her own family and everything else, but her relationship and her attraction to God through her mother-in-law was so significant that she virtually chooses a lifestyle of poverty over a sense of going back and having a husband and family of her own back in her homeland. So each year when Pentecost comes along, then during this time, the Feast of Weeks, then they're going to read the book of Ruth. Everybody with me now? Then look at the next one. This is the one I don't understand. Passover, we're going to read Song of Solomon. And the nearest that some people can come is maybe this is an allegory for God's love for his people. One of the most intelligent comments, I mean, I'm just trying to think, you know, I'm doing this out of my head and I don't have my Bible before me, but I think there's something like 13 animal varieties and 27 plants that are listed in Song of Solomon. I'm sorry, most girls in our culture are not going to be excited when you say you're as pretty as a horse's tail. Just all of these different physical descriptions that speak of beauty and other things in nature and on and on. When we lived in Memphis for 3 years, we worked with a church in Mississippi. And I don't know, someone asked, but I did a lesson on Song of Solomon. And one of our older, protected Southern ladies came out fanning herself, and she said, I didn't know that was in my Bible. And so, I'm sorry if you're 70 or 80 years old and you've been in the church for a long time and you've never read Song of Solomon, then she was just a little flushed by the time that she left, because that was an eye-opening experience for her. One of the comments I made, though, is that one of the enemies, whether it's of married love or spiritual love, is just taking things for granted. And the whole thought of you are beautiful, my love, and just the relationship that's described is there. I don't have a good answer. I'm really good with Ruth, Pentecost, but during the Passover, they annually would read Song of Solomon. Then during Ecclesiastes, let me do it the other way. Feast of Booths and Tabernacles, Jewish Thanksgiving in October. Then they're going to read Ecclesiastes. For everything there's a season. There's a time and a purpose for everything under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die. That makes sense compared to reading the Song of Solomon during the Passover. And then after the destruction of the temple especially, and this is going to give me a half second. This is going to take place on the 9th of August, 70 AD. Now, the Romans had surrounded the city for most of 2 years. The Romans did not get to kill virtually any of the Sadducees because the Jews on the inside had already killed them. And so the Romans just felt like there's blood flowing in the streets through this civil war. Let's just camp out and enjoy ourselves. And rather than shedding Roman blood, a large percentage of the people who were killed in the fall of Jerusalem were killed by Jews. It's just tragic. So, in memory of that and other defeats, then the lamentations, and again, talking with our children when they were small, the weeping prophet is Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is in Jerusalem when Jerusalem falls, and he is so sad that he writes a lament. So during the 9th of August, in memory of the fall of Jerusalem, then Lamentations is read, which is Jeremiah's heartfelt lament for that. And then, from what we've just finished, Esther is read during the Feast of Purim in the springtime. So these 5 roles, these shorter books of the Old Testament, became very significant because we become influenced from the things that we regularly hear. Someone help me, I've lost the term. It's not catechism, but there's a word in certain denominations where you read certain verses during certain times of the year. It's like a lexicon or something. I forget the technical word. But different church groups will say within 2 or 3 years, we're going to read through these particular texts, and they do that over and over again. Well, I'm not in favor of us doing that, but the benefit is those people become more familiar with those passages if they keep coming to church and they hear them regularly. Well, these 5 roles are going to be very much within the heart and the soul of Judaism, because when they have these different feasts and festivals and things, then that's when they're going to be read. And especially with Pentecost being after the wheat harvest is finished, then that was something that was very appropriate, and that's when the book of Ruth was read. Okay, we're back to the first page. I had a teacher who just majored on this, and I had quite a bit of school and stuff, but he just said, when you read your Hebrew Old Testament, and I'm not talking about having to do it in Hebrew, and I'm just talking about the Old Testament, he said the names are very significant in the Hebrew culture. And see, like for example, Brother McCord referred to Jacob as heel grabber. Trip people up, horse trader without ethics. Oh, we'll just put skins on and fool our old dad and all this other stuff. He wrestles with the angel all night, and his name is changed from Jacob to Israel. And when you have El, El is the root word for God. He who wrestles with God. And you think, if you're going to have one word to describe the rest of the Old Testament, is a group of people who wrestle with God. And so every time you see the word El, Daniel, God is strong, Ezekiel, Jerusalem, you see what I'm saying? And you'll see El tucked into a lot of Hebrew words. And so the names of people are significant. And after he had mentioned this, I read something, I've always wrote this down, and the guy just said, the story of Ruth can nearly be told by knowing the names of the characters in the book. So Naomi's husband is, see there it is, Elimelech. God is king. Before she loses her husband and her 2 sons, her name is Naomi, which means pleasantness, happiness, joy. You get a sense of kind of bubble there. After she lost the men in her family, then she says, don't call me Naomi, don't call me pleasantness, call me Mara, bitterness. And then, and I'm the first to say, I don't understand this, why you would name your son. Malon means mild or sickly, and Chelon means the pining one or wasting away. Don't ask why, that's what their names were. I don't know if they were sick when they were little or not, but look at how their names then are fulfilled as you read through the story. And so God is king, Elimelech, mild and sickly, Malon, the pining one and the wasting one are all going to pass away while they're in Moab for the 10 years. Do you see what I'm saying? The names nearly tell you the story. Boaz, fleetness or strength. When Boaz comes into the story, everything's going to change, both in terms of spiritually, financially, and as we're going to see, in terms of Hesed. Sorry, I don't want to offend anybody, but Ruth either means like a female friend or a companion, and as one of our Hebrew teachers says, a sight worth seeing. And so, depending upon your background, some older people would prefer a female companion or friend, but Ruth, can I use our word good-looking type thing? So you either have a sense of the companionship and the friendship, that's her name, or a sight worth seeing. And either one of those is appropriate for the girl. Then here come the offspring. Obed is going to mean serving or worshiper. Jesse is Jehovah exists. David means beloved. Do you see what I'm saying? If you've read the book of Ruth, but you know what the names of the characters mean, then the names of the characters nearly tell you the story of Ruth as you read through. We're going to mention this later, but I just want to touch on it. When we look at a biblical book, we can date it by the last events that are talked about. And we'll just touch on this a little bit later. But at the very, very end of the book of Ruth, then we have David. And here's what's helpful in terms of just the overall plan. And sorry, I don't have a visual, which we had a chalkboard. I can just turn around and do this. But if you do, Abraham is about 2,000. Moses, Mount Sinai is about 1,500. And then David is 1,000. And the people are carried into captivity in the early 600s. And then they come back in the 400s. David is very much at the center of the Old Testament story, especially from Mount Sinai until the people get carried into captivity. Okay? And so you go back, and again, here's the thread. It'll go Abraham, Isaac, Judah, Perez, Hezron, Ram, Abinadab, Nation, Salmon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David. So if we're doing kind of the center of the Old Testament story from Mount Sinai until the people are carried into captivity, then the prophet, the King David, is kind of that center figure. Let me do one other thing real quickly. And if you've been in Old Testament class, we've done this before. And I would never thought of this. When he did this, I just thought, oh, that's so helpful. Again, Old Testament class. He asked, what is the center of the law of Moses? What's the core of the law of Moses? And nothing came to mind. You know, sometimes you do that. When Brother McCord would ask a question, I very seldom said something because, like one day he said, what is the New Testament? And I thought, I'm not going to say 27 books, that's too obvious. And then he starts quoting 2 Corinthians 3, and the new covenant, the New Testament, is not written with ink. It's not written on stone, but where is it written? It's written on our hearts. So anytime Brother McCord asked a question, I just went, I'm going to just listen and see, because what seemed obvious was oftentimes not obvious. And I've never forgotten that. It's the covenant, it's the agreement within our hearts, within our lives. And that sense of being sealed by the Spirit is so significant. But we're back to this. He said, what's the center of the center? And he just held his hand down like this, and he said, let's count the books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then here it came. He said, for those of us as Gentiles, the first book that we kind of really relate to, and we love Genesis because of the stories and the creation and everything. He said if we were Hebrews, what Genesis is to us as Gentiles is what Leviticus would be to us if we were Hebrews. And I'm thinking, okay, help me. I don't get that right off. He said, Dad, you can take your son and he can watch the priest do many of the sacrifices and the things that happen. So he said Leviticus, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but he said Leviticus was much like show and tell. Well, how different is it when you can see these things happening than when we read them from afar? But he stayed with this, and then he turned his hand over and he said, and of course we're in Leviticus, he said, what is the center of the center? The Day of Atonement. Leviticus 16 is in the center of the center book of the Torah and the law. And I just sat there and just kind of shook the chills down, because I thought, okay, how would we know in the book of Hebrews that he went into heaven beyond a curtain that was not made with hands, not with the blood of bulls and goats, but he went with his own blood to secure redemption for his people? And the primary visual aid of what Jesus is going to do in heaven with his own blood for our sin is revealed to us in type and shadow and visual aid in the center of the law of Moses. And I have to do it again. I just literally got the chills because I thought I had never seen that before. And God is unfolding his purposes and showing his will to his people. But the center of the law was the Day of Atonement, at-one-ment. And this was the only prescribed F-A-S-T, the only fast of the year. And the high priest offered a sacrifice for himself and for his family. They have the two goats. One becomes the scapegoat. They confess the sins of the people. He's carried away. The other becomes the sacrifice, and only once a year does he go in, and that becomes the center of that. Well, in the same way that the Day of Atonement is at the center of the Torah, the law, then look at how the life of David is at the center of the Old Testament story when we go especially from Mount Sinai to the end. For all the things that David did, and there were many, one of the both just eternal blessings is 75 of the 150 Psalms are attributed to David. Others may be his. They sound very similar. But 73 in the book of Psalms have the name of David on them. Twice in the New Testament, the writer will say, oh, David said, and we'll quote a psalm that doesn't have a name on it. And so, again, here's this book of praise and worship, and that's such a significant thing. I want us to look at the word hesed. If you have this, we're down on number 5. And I always hesitate. I don't like using words that we don't use a lot, but here's a word that's too big to tell. And as you're going to see, we don't have, well, let me say it the other way. A part of the reason why it's so hard for us to kind of get a handle on this word is that there are up to 25 to 30 English words that are used in English translations to translate this one word. Can I just say it's too big to tell? It's too big to limit to just one word. And so notice what takes place. Here's one of the most beautiful and complex words in the Old Testament. Here are some of its friends. Devotion, fidelity, loyalty, even the knowledge of God. And this is important. I'm on 5:2. This Hebrew word is used 245 times in your Old Testament. The RSV, of those 245, 178 will use the term steadfast love. We sing a song, the steadfast love. So we know this word in a lot of different ways, but if you look at that, in the RSV, 178 times it's steadfast love, and then there's a whole bunch of others, depending upon the context and how the word is used. So I'm in 5:3. New English Bible will use 33 different words in English to describe this word. A different translation will use 31. The NIV will use 25. So all I want you to see is that here's this very complex word, that there's not any one English word that quite says that. I've told you this. We had an Italian family that ran a grocery store around the corner for us, and he was not your best store worker. And I went in one day, and Mama was taking strips off of him in Italian, and Italian is so expressive. I mean, she's going on and on and on. And then a little bit, there's this Australian, the word cheeky is like smart aleck, sassy, or whatever, and in the middle of all this Italian, she stops and she says, and besides that, you are a cheeky boy. So I didn't understand anything except one little phrase, except I knew from Mama's voice that she was not happy with Junior and she was letting him have it. But there was nothing in Italian that said, you are a cheeky boy. Al and Dean Waller worked in France, and there were 2 or 3 times that he would look at Dean and he would get caught because there was a word in French that we don't have in English that says just that. And so this is why this word's so important. And again, if you've never looked at it, just get a Young's Concordance and look at love, and then you'll see different words that are used under love in the Old Testament. And here's some other things. 5:5. Well, let's do 5:4. Hesed is often spoken of in terms of love, kindness, and loyalty. It's used in the context of relationships and people who are close to one another, and this relationship is not dissolved by death. Naomi, blessed be he by the Lord whose kindness, Hesed, has not forsaken the living or the dead. So it's a relationship word, and a writer said it's possible to have Hesed without covenant. It is not possible to have a covenant without Hesed. I don't verbalize this, but sometimes during a wedding, when she comes to the door, I think if she could see the stack of dishes she's going to wash with this guy, she would run out that door and run for her life. And we always say for better or worse. And yes, we do it one day at a time. I was trying to be consoling once. I obviously had Mrs. H upset, and I just tried to be helpful. I said, sweetheart, you said for better or for worse. And if you know my wife, she quietly said yes. I didn't know how worse it was going to get. Love with loyalty. I was in a church where a deacon is eventually put into prison for misconduct with a daughter-in-law. The kid said, he's in prison, Mom, divorce him and leave him. And Mom said, I've sinned, he has sinned. And I said, for better or for worse, and I will be here when he comes back. And that's what I'm saying. You can have Hesed without a covenant, but you can't be in a covenant without Hesed. And the bottom line is God's love extended to us is love that we share with other people. So number 6, and again, here are terms: reciprocity, reciprocal, mutual assistance, sincerity, friendliness, brotherliness, duty, loyalty, love. Faithfulness is inherent within Hesed. And this is my favorite one, loyal affection. It's an emotion, but it's not driven by emotion, and it's a commitment. And like I said, we've all seen people who've just, like, bless his heart, we had a man that, she had a stroke. They lived up toward Jones in a little trailer house. His son lived with them, and so at night, he had this apparatus behind his truck to sweep parking lots, like Crest parking lot and stuff. And his wife had a stroke, and for 12 years, she's bedfast. She can't talk. He feeds her liquids and other stuff. And I took Heather, our middle one, when she was a sophomore, and I said, Heather, you need to get ready. I said, she's shriveled up, but I said, when you listen to him, you will think you're about to meet Miss Oklahoma. But I just need to prepare you for what you're going to see. So we knock on the door, and he comes to the door, and she's in the back to her aisle. He says, Ida, we've got company. We go back, and he starts telling us, I have done her hair and her nails for the last 10 years. Ladies, how scary is that? For your husband to be, but she couldn't do it herself. And she's in bed like this and can't talk verbally. And we go in, and he touches her on the shoulder, and he brushes her hair, and isn't she beautiful, and on and on. And my daughter, as a sophomore, is just about to lose her mind, thinking, this is absolutely crazy. Well, there's a list here on the wall, and Heather said, what's that? And he said, well, those are the things that if I feed her, she spits back on me. And that's the best communication that we've had in 10 years. But I try to keep a list of those things so I don't feed those to her, so we don't have to go through that. After the service, we're out in the foyer, and I said, Foy, 12 years. You haven't talked, She hasn't responded. You've fed her. You've worked at night so you can stay up with her in the daytime. And you've treated her like a princess. There's been no sexual relationships, on and on. How did you do this for 12 years? And this little kind of elfish-looking man, he just quietly said, well, I knew what I was saying when I said one day for better or for worse. And see, that's what Hesed is. Hesed is this loyal affection that has this sense of commitment to it, and because this is what we have received spiritually from God, then this is what we're called to extend to other people. And then notice this as we work through this the next couple of weeks. Look at how Naomi is going to extend Hesed to Ruth. Go back to your family. That's what's best. Notice how Ruth is going to extend Hesed to her mother-in-law. And then notice how Boaz is going to take on a family that he's not going to get any benefit from to propagate the seed of someone who's dead. And all of the major characters in this story are the Word becoming flesh within this concept of Hesed, which is such an important word. This bottom thing, and this is nearly a whole lesson. In the Hebrew Bible, God is going to be attributed both with good and bad. In our Western society, like, good things come from God and we struggle with bad. But what did Job say? Naked I came into the world, naked I shall return. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And I encourage you to read Isaiah 45, and it's like 5 through 7. Older translations will say, I make weal and woe. I make good things and bad. And here's what's significant. In the Hebrew world, rather than saying, well, here's good and this is God, and then we don't know where this came from, and this is true with those Psalms of lament, which are hard for us to read sometimes, they still looked at God even when things were difficult and hard. Do not call me Naomi. Do not call me pleasantness. Call me Mara, bitterness. Why? Oh, the hand of the Lord is upon me. And what's amazing is that, and we've all seen this, people will come to an intersection of life and will have some type of tragedy, and some people will turn away from God, never to come back. How could he let this happen? And that same thing will draw other people to God. And that's such an important thing that runs through the Old Testament. So if you turn the page, Ruth had seen Naomi both at weddings and funerals. Right? We got 2 girls who've married, and she's going to see her mother-in-law at 3 funerals. And this is one of those things that just haunts me in a positive way. And I'm not putting anything on you as ladies, it's true of us as men. But would any of us with our relationship with our in-laws cause them to love us well enough that they would leave their family, their culture, their home, but most importantly, they would leave their God? In the days when the judges ruled, Ruth 1:1, and you'll see the girls' names, Orpah and Ruth. They're there about 10 years, and all the men die. The Lord visited the homeland. They've given them food. So Naomi is getting ready to go back in verse 8, return to your mother's house. May the Lord, and listen to how the word Lord is on her lips all the time. May the Lord deal kindly with you if you've dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you to find rest. The 2 daughter-in-laws start weeping. Orpah follows her mother-in-law's instructions, and she goes home. And Ruth makes a very committed decision. No, I will choose a life of poverty. I will choose the unknown, and I will choose the uncertain to be with my mother-in-law. I've said this later a couple of times. Well, this is a beautiful, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. A couple of times, a couple said, we'd like to have that, and I've just quietly asked, did you realize that this was said to a mother-in-law rather than to a bride and groom? And a couple of times that has been withdrawn from the wedding. I'm not making a moral judgment, but I'm just saying I felt like they should actually, it's a beautiful, and there's some songs, Whither Thou Goest, and all this other stuff. And I just said, it's in the Bible, it's great words. However, the original context was spoken to a mother-in-law. And there wasn't a major sense of conflict, but one girl says, well, I think we can find something else to, to read. Morris Thurman preached at Memorial Road, which became College Church, and this young couple came in and they said, maybe even before our vows or before we kiss each other, we just love this song, Dear Lord and Father of Mankind. And he said, that's a wonderful song, but just listen for a second. Here the two of you up in front. Dear Lord and Father of mankind, forgive our foolish ways. Reclothe us in our rightful minds. He said, that's a beautiful song. I don't know if you want to be asking for God to restore you to your rightful minds, either before or after that you do your vows. And so they decided, there might be another song that we might sing there. The Lord grant you to find rest. Look at verse 13. The hand of the Lord has been bitter to me, gone out against me. Orpha kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And here it is. I'm going where you go. Your people will be my people. And the most important thing to me in this whole thing is your God will be my God. So when you look at the next page, we've looked at this. No, call me Naomi, sweetness. Call me Mara, bitterness. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty, 121. And this is what's so amazing about this lady, is that her faith in God is so strong that she can even attribute the loss and the emptiness in her life to God without blaming God or turning away from God. And yes, it made her sad. And that's why the largest majority of Psalms in the book of Psalms are laments. And it's a language of faith that's hard for us to pronounce sometimes, where we can cry out to God like Job did, but not blame God for that. When you look at the end of the book of Job, well, let me just do it this other way. I'm in number 2, down toward the middle. The girls mentioned in the genealogy in Matthew. So we have Perez, who commits incest with his daughter-in-law Tamar. Then we have Boaz, who is by Rahab, who was a prostitute in Jericho. And then we have Obed by Ruth, who is a Moabitess. And then we have David was the father of Solomon. And it doesn't say Bathsheba, it says by the wife of Uriah. And then we have Mary. This to me is just one of those amazing things, is that in the genealogy of Jesus, we have 5 women who are mentioned, and how much scorn and criticism is Mary going to get for being pregnant and not being married. And when you look through this, then Ruth is going to be the great-great-grandmother of David. If you'll turn to the last page, I want to do 2 things on the top, and then we'll go. Thank you for your patience. Here's what I'd like to leave you with. Hesed, love with loyalty. You look into the backstory, you look kind of in between the lines, and what does the faith and the life of Naomi say in terms of the impact that has on her daughter-in-law? Now, I know some in-law relationships are contentious. I understand that. I don't have any problem with that. My mother-in-law was a dream. Other than 3 preachers, she had more books than anybody I'd ever met in my life. Literally everywhere in the house where you could have shelves, there were books. She passes away. Craig's living in the house. 15 of us carried books out for 3 weeks, and then we donated 17 boxes of photocopy books after we'd carried books out for 3 weeks. I could call Mom about anything in the Bible. She had read it. She had been there before. And I've told you this, but I'll do it real quick. We've been dating a little while. We're driving home from Bethany. I've done something wrong, but I don't know what it is. And I said, is everything okay? And she said, no. Silence. Can we talk about it? Well, maybe. Silence. We're headed toward Bethany, headed toward, Penn Square. And finally Sheila says, it's not fair. And I said, pardon? She said, it's not fair. I said, help me. I've been in this family 18 years, and you've been here 6 weeks, and my mother likes you better than she likes me. I made everything better when I just said quietly, sweetheart, I can't help it if your mom has good taste. And that just made everything that smoothed everything over. But within a month, I was calling her mom. And she read for us, she read to us. And when you listen to Richard and Craig teach, then here they have been read to by a mom when they first came home from the hospital. And all I'm saying is that in all of our relationships, including our in-law relationships, we have an opportunity to express hesed. I grew roses outside Mom's garage because she read outside, and when the wind was out of the south, I wanted her to be able to smell fragrant roses while she's reading on her back patio. Always sent her a Valentine's card, and Sheila's birthday is the 22nd of September, and I always sent my mother-in-law a birthday card for the joy of bringing my wife into the world and being her mother. And like Sheila said, she'll choose you any day before she'll choose me. But here's what I wanted to say spiritually. There's an opportunity. We had dear friends in Mississippi, and Grandma House, I mentioned her, was this older lady, and Miss Pam was not a Christian when they got married. And I was talking to her one day, and I said, how did you become a Christian? She said, how could you be around Grandma House and not be a Christian? This was mother-in-law. Taught in a one-room school for 40 years. ABC and algebra every day. Dozens of kids went to Ole Miss and Mississippi State and had one teacher when they went to university. She read every word of the Wall Street Journal so she would know what was going on in the world. And this woman was kind of the spiritual heartbeat of her family and of the church. So be thinking about hesed, love with loyalty, and think, this is what we've experienced from God, and how many different relationships as we watch the story unfold with these wonderful people living in a time when every man did what was right in his own eyes, but they were still godly people in an ungodly age, and they will be wonderful examples for us to try to extend hesed to the relationships of people that we love and know today.